Have you ever felt so lost that you wondered if God had forgotten your name? Hank Weller knew that feeling all too well. At 34, his faith was as empty as the bottle on his kitchen table. St. Brigid's church, where he once knelt with his mother every Sunday, had been empty for years. But when lightning struck and flames started eating away at the old sanctuary, something inside him woke up. He ran into that fire to save the Virgin Mary statue his mother loved. The flames burned him badly, but he kept going. He walked out, holding that statue, his skin blistered and clothes charred. The whole town saw it happen. Was it really a miracle? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the fire, Hank Weller sat on the edge of his hospital bed, staring at his bandaged hands. The antiseptic smell couldn't mask the lingering scent of smoke that clung to his skin. Through the window, he could see the blackened skeleton of St. Brigid's church rising against the grey September sky. His mother's rosary lay on the bedside table. Somehow he'd been clutching it when they found him unconscious outside the church, the Virgin Mary statue cradled in his arms. The beads were melted in places, but Margaret Weller's initials were still visible on the small medallion she'd had engraved 40 years ago. Margaret. Even now, 3 years after the accident, thinking her name felt like pressing on a fresh bruise. She'd been everything to him, teacher, confidant, moral compass. Every Sunday morning for 18 years, she'd wake him gently and walk hand in hand with him down Maple Street to St. Brigid's. God listens closest when we come to him together, she used to say. Settling into their usual pew, 3rd row from the front, always on the right side where morning light fell through the stained glass windows. Those windows were gone now, shattered by the heat. The car accident had happened on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Hank had been driving his mother home from her volunteer shift at the food pantry when a drunk driver ran the red light at 5th and Main. Margaret died on the way to the hospital, her hand still reaching toward him from the passenger seat. 4 months afterward, Hank replayed every second of that drive. If he'd left 5 minutes later, if he'd taken the long way home. The guilt ate at him like acid, dissolving everything he'd once believed about God's plan, about purpose, about whether any of it meant anything at all. The drinking started as a way to sleep. Then it became a way to get through the days. His supervisor at McKinnon's auto shop, old Pete McKinnon, had been patient longer than Hank deserved. "Take the time you need, son," Pete had said after the funeral. "Your mother was a saint." But time hadn't healed anything. Hank showed up to work drunk more often than sober. He stopped returning phone calls from friends. He avoided Main Street on Sundays when families walked to the Methodist church because the sight of mothers and sons together made him want to put his fist through a wall. St. Brigid's had been closed for 2 years before the accident. The diocese couldn't afford to maintain a church with only 12 regular parishioners. But Hank had kept the spare key his mother used for her volunteer cleaning duties. When the loneliness became unbearable, he'd slip inside and sit in their old pew, nursing a bottle of Jack Daniels and talking to empty air. "I don't know what you want from me," he'd whisper to the shadows. "I tried to save her, but she's gone and I'm still here and it doesn't make any sense." The Virgin Mary statue had always been Margaret's favorite. She'd touch the hem of Mary's blue robe every Sunday after communion, closing her eyes and moving her lips in silent prayer. Sometimes she'd light a candle at the small altar beneath the statue, usually for someone in town who was sick or struggling. "Mary understands a mother's heart," she'd told Hank once. "She knows what it means to watch your child suffer." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Patricia Stevens stepped into the room, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. She'd delivered half the babies in Millbrook Falls, and her eyes held the steady compassion that came from 40 years of witnessing both miracles and tragedies. "How are the hands feeling this morning?" she asked, settling into the visitor's chair. "Like I stuck them in a campfire," Hank said. The burns on his palms and fingers were second degree, painful but not permanent. The burns on his arms and chest were more serious, but even those seemed to be healing faster than expected. I've been practicing medicine for 42 years, she said, pulling his chart from her clipboard. I've treated burns from house fires, car accidents, industrial mishaps. I've never seen anyone walk away from a structure fire with injuries this minor. Hank shifted uncomfortably. Maybe I got lucky. Lucky. Dr. Stevens removed her reading glasses and looked at him directly. Hank, according to the fire chief's report, you were inside that building for nearly 8 minutes. The temperature in the sanctuary reached over 1100 degrees. Through the window, Hank could see people walking past the hospital, some slowing down to peer up at his room. Word traveled fast in a town of 4,300 people. By now, everyone knew that Hank Weller, the drunk who'd killed his own mother, the one who'd spent 3 years hiding from God, had run into a burning church and come out carrying a statue. Doc, you've known me since I was 10 years old, he said quietly. You know I'm not the kind of person miracles happen to. Dr. Stevens smiled, the same gentle expression she'd worn when she'd set his broken arm after he fell out of the Mackenzie's apple tree at age 12. Hank, in my experience, miracles happen precisely to the people who think they don't deserve them. A heavier knock echoed from the doorway. Father Murphy appeared, his tall frame filling the entrance. He'd retired from active ministry 5 years ago, but he still carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades shepherding lost souls. His white hair was disheveled, and his usually pressed black shirt looked like he'd slept in it. Mind if an old priest visits a while? He asked. Dr. Stevens gathered her things. I'll check on you this afternoon, Hank. Try to rest. She paused at the door. And try not to think so hard about why good things happen. Sometimes they just do. Father Murphy waited until her footsteps faded before settling into the chair. He looked tired, older than his 71 years, but his green eyes still held the spark of someone who'd seen enough of life to find wonder in its mysteries. Brought you something, he said, reaching into a canvas bag. The Virgin Mary statue sat in Father Murphy's lap, somehow both exactly as Hank remembered and completely transformed. The blue paint of her robes was darkened by smoke, her serene, a face streaked with soot, but she remained unbroken. If anything, the fire had given her a quality of weathered endurance, like a lighthouse that had stood against too many storms to count. Found her right where you left her, Father Murphy said. Amazing thing. Everything around her was ash, but she wasn't even cracked. Hank reached out with bandaged fingers to touch the statue's base, then stopped. I don't know why I went. In there, Father? I don't even know if I believe anymore. Belief isn't always a feeling, son. Sometimes it's just a choice you make when everything else falls apart. Father Murphy turned the statue slightly, revealing something Hank had never noticed before, a small seam in the base, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Your mother asked me to give you this if anything ever happened to her. I've been carrying it around for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. Hidden in the compartment was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and written in Margaret's careful script. Hank's name was written on the outside in blue ink. His hands shook as he unfolded it. My dearest Henry, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I've gone home ahead of you, and I imagine you're blaming yourself for things that were never your fault to begin with. I know you've been struggling with faith, with church, with whether any of this matters. I know because I struggled too, especially after your father died. But here's what I learned. God doesn't love us because we're perfect. He loves us because we're His, broken pieces and all. You are my greatest joy, Henry. Don't carry guilt that isn't yours to carry. Find your way back to church, not because you have to, but because that's where you'll remember who you really are. The boy who used to hold my hand during the Our Father. The son who made me proud every single day. That person is still in there, waiting for you to come home. Father Murphy sat quietly while Hank wept. Deep chest-shaking sobs that came from 3 years of buried grief finally finding air. When the tears slowed, the old priest handed him tissues and waited. "She knew," Hank whispered. "She knew I'd blame myself. Your mother was a wise woman. She also had faith that you'd eventually find your way back." Father Murphy gestured toward the window, where the ruins of St. Brigid stood against the sky. "Maybe last night was the beginning of that journey." Hank looked at the statue again, really looked at her. She looked less like an untouchable religious icon, and more like someone who'd been through the fire and emerged with hard-won wisdom. "What happens now?" Hank asked. Father Murphy smiled. "Now you get better. Then you decide whether you want to rebuild what was lost or build something entirely new. But Hank, whatever you decide, you don't have to do it alone." After the priest left, Hank lay back against his pillows and closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like possibility. 2 days later, Hank was discharged from the hospital with strict instructions to keep his burns clean and dry. He'd expected to go home to his empty house on Elm Street, to sit in his father's old recliner and stare at the water stains on the ceiling until the pain medication wore off. Instead, he found himself walking slowly down Maple Street toward the remains of St. Brigid's. The fire department had cordoned off the area with yellow tape, but several townspeople stood at the perimeter, talking in hushed voices. Mrs. Chen from the library was there, along with Rose McKenna from the house next to his, and even Pete McKinnon, who'd given Hank the week off without asking questions. "Hank," Rose called softly as he approached. She was 62, a widow whose husband had died in Afghanistan 15 years ago. She'd been Margaret's closest friend, the kind of neighbor who brought casseroles during grief and never expected thanks. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he admitted, wincing as he adjusted the sling supporting his left arm. The deeper burns, they would take weeks to heal properly. Rose's eyes were red-rimmed like she'd been crying. I'm thinking about your mother. How proud she'd be." "Proud of what? I nearly got myself killed for a statue." "You saved something sacred," Mrs. Chen interjected. The elderly librarian was barely 5 feet tall, but her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years keeping the town's history organized. "Do you know how old that statue is? It came from Ireland in 1892 when the church was built. It survived the flood of 1943, the tornado in 78, and the earthquake that cracked the foundation in 99. Your mother used to say it was the heart of the church." Hank stared at the blackened ruins. The walls still stood, but the roof had collapsed entirely. Piles of charred wood and melted metal filled the sanctuary where he'd once sat beside his mother, listening to Father O'Brien, Father Murphy's predecessor, talk about forgiveness and redemption in his thick Irish accent. "The fire inspectors are coming this afternoon," Pete McKinnon said, adjusting his worn baseball cap. "County wants to condemn the whole thing, tear it down, and sell the lot." "Sell it for what?" Hank asked. "Strip mall, probably. Maybe a gas station." Pete spat into the weeds. "Progress, they call it." Something cold settled in Hank's stomach. The idea of St. Brigid's becoming a convenience store felt like a second death, another piece of his mother being erased from the world. He thought about Margaret lighting candles at the altar, kneeling in their pew every Sunday, touching the Virgin Mary's robe with such reverence it made him embarrassed to watch. "There's got to be something we can do," he said. Rose looked surprised. "You want to save the church?" Hank didn't answer immediately. 3 days ago, he would have said the church could burn to the ground for all he cared. But standing here now, reading his mother's letter over and over in his mind, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with guilt or grief. "Maybe," he said finally. That afternoon, Hank sat in the town records office while Mrs. Chen pulled dusty files from metal cabinets that looked older than he was. The building smelled like old paper and furniture polish, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead like tired insects. "Here we are," Mrs. Chen said, spreading a manila folder across the reading table. "St. Brigid's Catholic Church. Established. 1892. The building plans were hand-drawn on yellowed paper, signed by an architect named William Murphy, no relation to Father Murphy, according to the notes. But what caught Hank's attention was a letter paper clipped to the front of the folder, written in faded ink by the church's founding pastor, Father Sean O'Malley. "It is our intention," Hank read aloud, "that this house of worship serve as sanctuary for those who have lost their way. May it stand as beacon for the broken-hearted, the grieving, and the forgotten. May all who enter find rest for their weary souls." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Your mother loved that letter. She used to say St. Brigid's was built specifically for people like her, ordinary folks who needed a place to remember they weren't forgotten. People like her, people like him." That evening, Hank was heating a can of soup with his good hand when someone knocked on his front door. He wasn't expecting anyone. Most people in town had been giving him a wide berth since the accident, either out of respect for his grief or discomfort with his drinking. He opened the door to find Rose McKenna standing on his porch, holding a covered casserole dish. "Thought you might be hungry," she said. "It's Margaret's recipe for chicken and dumplings. She gave it to me years ago." Hank stepped aside to let her in. His house was a mess. Empty bottles on the coffee table, dirty dishes in the sink, mail piled unopened on the kitchen counter. If Rose noticed, she didn't say anything. "You don't have to take care of me," he said, as she set the dish on his stove. "I'm not taking care of you," Rose replied, washing his dirty dishes without being asked. "I'm being neighborly. There's a difference." She worked quietly for a few minutes, and Hank found himself watching her careful movements, remembering how she and his mother used to garden together every spring, sharing seeds and stories across their adjoining fence. Rose had never remarried after losing her husband, but she'd never become bitter either. She volunteered at the elementary school, organized the annual Christmas food drive, and somehow always knew when someone needed a casserole or a listening ear. "Rose," he said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "After David died, how did you keep believing? How did you keep going to church and praying and acting like God was still listening?" Rose dried her hands on his dish towel and turned to face him. Her expression was thoughtful, the look of someone who'd wrestled with hard questions and emerged with hard-won answers. "I didn't, for a while," she said. "I was angry at God for 2 solid years, wouldn't set foot in church, wouldn't pray, wouldn't even say grace over my meals. I figured if God wanted my husband dead at 47, then God could manage without my worship. What changed? Your mother, actually." Rose smiled at the memory. "She showed up at my door one Sunday morning with a thermos of coffee and said, 'I'm not asking you to come to church. I'm asking you to come sit with me.' So I did. We sat in your mother's pew, and I cried through the entire service. Father O'Brien was preaching about the prodigal son, and I realized I'd been waiting for God to apologize to me for taking David. But that's not how it works. And how does it work? God doesn't owe us explanations, Hank, but he does promise that we're not alone in the dark places." Rose folded the dish towel carefully and hung it on the oven handle. "Your mother never stopped praying for you, even when you stopped praying for yourself, especially then." After Rose left, Hank sat at his kitchen table and reread his mother's letter. The paper was soft from folding and unfolding, and some of the ink had smeared from his tears, but every word was burned into his memory now. "Find your way back to church, Henry. Not because you have to, but because that's where you'll remember who you really are." He looked out his kitchen window toward the ruins of St. Brigid's. In the fading daylight, the blackened walls looked less like destruction and more like the beginning of something. The foundation was still solid. He could see that even from here. The basic structure was intact. Maybe that was enough to build on. That night, Hank dreamed of fire for the first time since the accident. But instead of the twisted metal and screaming sirens that usually filled his nightmares, he dreamed of walking through flames that felt like warm water. His mother was there, young and healthy, reaching out to take his hand. "You found her, Margaret said, nodding toward the Virgin Mary statue which stood unharmed in the center of the burning sanctuary. "I found you," Hank replied. "No, sweetheart. You found yourself." His mother's smile was radiant, peaceful, and now you know what to do. He woke before dawn with the absolute certainty that his real life was just beginning. The next morning, Hank drove to the town records office with his right hand gripping the steering wheel and his left arm still in a sling. Mrs. Chen was waiting for him with a stack of files and a pot of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. "I pulled everything we have on St. Brigid's," she said, spreading documents across the reading table. "Building permits, maintenance records, parish bulletins going back to 1892. Your mother spent hours here last year researching the church's history for the Historical Society." Hank picked up a photograph from 1920 showing the church in its prime, white clapboard siding gleaming in the sunlight, a proper bell tower, gardens flanking the front steps where dozens of parishioners stood, in their Sunday best. It looked nothing like the neglected building he'd known in recent years. "Look at this," Mrs. Chen said, unfolding the original architectural plans. The church was designed by William Murphy. He was inspired by the monastery churches of County Cork, where his family came from. Every detail had spiritual significance. The blueprints showed careful attention to symbolism. The sanctuary faced east toward the rising sun. The windows were positioned to create a cross of light on the altar at dawn. Even the foundation stones were laid in a pattern that represented the 12 apostles. "But here's what's really interesting," Mrs. Chen continued, pulling out a leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Father O'Malley, the founding pastor. Listen to this entry from September 15th, 1892. We have built this church not for the righteous, but for the lost. May it stand as a lighthouse for those drowning in darkness, a harbor for souls weathered by life's storms." Hank felt a chill run down his spine. "He built it for people like me. People like all of us, at one time or another." Mrs. Chen poured him a cup of coffee. "Your mother believed this place had a special calling. She used to say St. Brigid's wasn't just a church, it was a healing place." As Hank studied the plans, he noticed something else. The original design included a small apartment above the sanctuary, intended for a resident caretaker. It had been walled off decades ago when the parish could no longer afford a full-time groundskeeper, but the space was still there. "Mrs. Chen, who owns the property now?" "The diocese still holds the deed, but they've been trying to sell it for 2 years. No buyers yet. The building was in too poor condition even before the fire." An idea began forming in Hank's mind. Fragile. A spider silk, but gaining strength with each passing moment. "What would it take to buy it?" Mrs. Chen raised her eyebrows. "Are you serious?" "Maybe. I don't know yet. But what would it take?" She rummaged through another file. "According to the diocesan correspondence, they'd sell for $60,000. That includes the building, what's left of it, and the 2 acres of land. $60,000. Hank made $38,000 a year at the auto shop when he was working regularly. He had maybe $4,000 in savings, and that was only because he'd been too drunk to spend money on anything except liquor for the past 3 years. But as he stared at the old photographs of St. Brigid's in its glory days, filled with families and hope and purpose, he felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since his mother's death, the desire to build something instead of just watching things fall apart. That afternoon, he drove to McKinnon's auto shop. Pete was under the hood of a 1995 Ford pickup, cursing at a stubborn radiator hose. When he saw Hank approaching, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "You're supposed to be resting," Pete said, but his tone was gentle. "I need to ask you something." Hank took a deep breath. "How much vacation time do I have saved up?" "About 6 weeks. Why?" "I want to use it, all of it, and when it's gone, I want to take a leave of absence." Pete studied his face. "This about the church?" "Yeah. You thinking of rebuilding it?" "I'm thinking of trying." Pete nodded slowly. He'd known Hank since he was 16 and started working part-time after school. He'd watched him grow from a shy kid who was afraid to use the power tools into one of the best mechanics in 3 counties. He'd also watched him fall apart after Margaret died, showing up late and smelling like whiskey, making careless mistakes. That could have gotten someone hurt. "You know anything about construction?" Pete asked. "My dad taught me carpentry when I was young. I built that deck on my house a few years ago." "Building a deck and rebuilding a church are different animals entirely." "I know that." Pete was quiet for a long moment, studying Hank's face. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "My brother-in-law, Tom, runs a construction company in Springfield. He's done church restorations before. Good man, fair prices. Tell him I sent you." "Pete, I can't afford—" "I didn't say you had to hire him tomorrow. I said talk to him. Learn what you're getting into before you jump off the cliff." Pete handed him the card. "And Hank, take all the time you need. Your job will be here when you're ready." That evening, Hank called Tom Bradley. The conversation lasted an hour, and by the end of it, Hank's head was spinning with information about foundation repair, electrical systems, building codes, and permit applications. The project would cost at least $80,000, not counting labor. It would take 6 months minimum, assuming no complications, and that was if the foundation was as solid as it looked. "But here's the thing," Tom said. "I've restored 4 churches in the past 10 years. Every one of them found a way to fund the work. People care about these old buildings more than you'd think. Sometimes you just have to give them a reason to help." After hanging up, Hank sat on his front porch and watched the sun set behind the church ruins. The skeleton of the building looked different now, less like an ending and more like a beginning. In his mind, he could see it restored. White walls gleaming in the morning light, the bell tower rebuilt and crowned with a simple cross, gardens blooming where weeds had taken over. He could see his mother sitting in their old pew, smiling. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Father Murphy was walking up his driveway, moving carefully in the gathering darkness. "Evening, Hank. Mind if I join you?" "Course not." Hank gestured to the other porch chair. "What brings you by?" "Been thinking about our conversation at the hospital, about rebuilding." Father Murphy settled into the chair with a soft grunt. "I made some calls today. The diocese is willing to negotiate on the price if the buyer has a solid restoration plan." "How much negotiation?" "Depends on what you're proposing to do with it." Hank was quiet for a moment, listening to the evening sounds of his neighborhood, dogs barking, televisions murmuring through open windows, the distant hum of traffic on Highway 9, normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. For 3 years, he'd felt like an outsider, looking in at all that normalcy, too broken to participate. "I want to rebuild it," he said finally. "Not just the building, the whole thing, the community, the purpose, the reason it was built in the first place." "That's a big job for one man." "Then maybe I won't do it alone." Father Murphy smiled. "Your mother always said you had more faith than you realized, even when you couldn't see it yourself." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began appearing overhead. For the first time since the accident, Hank felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not running away from his pain, but sitting with it, letting it teach him something about what mattered. "Father," he said eventually, "tomorrow I'm going to start making calls, see what it would really take to make this happen." "And if it turns out to be impossible?" Hank touched the rosary in his pocket, feeling the melted beads his mother had. "Worn smooth with decades of prayer, then at least I'll know I tried." As Father Murphy walked back down the driveway, Hank remained on his porch until well after midnight, planning and dreaming and praying for the first time in 3 years. He was still afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of hoping too much, afraid of discovering he wasn't the man his mother believed he could be, but he was more afraid of staying the same. The police station smelled like coffee and disinfectant. Hank sat across from Chief William Hartley's desk, holding a manila envelope that contained 3 years of questions he'd been too afraid to ask. His burns ached under the fresh bandages, but the pain felt appropriate somehow, like penance for all the time he'd wasted believing a lie. "You sure you want to see this?" Chief Hartley asked. He was 55, a career cop who'd worked the accident scene that night. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. I need to know what really happened. Hartley slid the accident report across his desk. The official police investigation was 12 pages long, filled with measurements, witness statements, and technical analysis that reduced the worst night of Hank's life to cold facts and numbered diagrams. But on page 7, Hank found something that stopped his breath. Preliminary examination of the deceased indicates cardiac arrest occurred approximately 30 seconds prior to impact, he read aloud. Victim was likely unconscious before collision took place. The words blurred on the page. Margaret had suffered a heart attack before the crash. She died before the other driver hit them, which meant, "You didn't kill your mother, son," Chief Hartley said gently. "I've been waiting 3 years for you to ask for this report, hoping you'd figure that out." Hank's hands shook as he continued reading. The drunk driver, Thomas Mitchell, aged 29, had been traveling at 68 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Even if Hank had been driving perfectly, the physics of the collision would have been the same. There was nothing he could have done differently. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before?" "We tried. Your mother's doctor tried. Father Murphy tried. But you weren't ready to hear it." Hartley leaned back in his chair. "Grief makes people deaf. So everything except their own guilt." Hank walked out of the police station, feeling like he'd been turned inside out. 3 years of self-destruction based on a lie he'd told himself. 3 years of drowning in alcohol and anger, while his mother's real legacy, her kindness, her faith, her belief in second chances, sat waiting for him to remember it. He drove straight to St. Brigid's and stood at the edge of the ruins. The yellow tape was gone now, and the fire inspector's report was posted on a temporary sign, "Structure condemned, demolition scheduled for October 15th, 3 weeks. He had 3 weeks to figure out how to save a building that most people considered worthless, using money he didn't have and skills he wasn't sure he possessed. But as he studied the blackened walls, Hank noticed something the inspector had missed. The foundation stones were still perfectly aligned, their mortared joints uncracked. The basic structure was sound. It was only the interior that had been destroyed. Like himself, perhaps. Damaged but not beyond repair. Talking to yourself or talking to God? Hank turned to find Father Murphy approaching with 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street. Little of both, I guess. Hank accepted the coffee gratefully. "Just found out I didn't kill my mother." "Ah." Father Murphy nodded. "About time you learned that. You knew?" "I've known since the night it happened. But knowing something and accepting it are different things entirely." The old priest sat down on a piece of fallen timber. "How do you feel?" Hank considered the question seriously. How did he feel? Relieved, certainly. Angry at himself for wasting 3 years. Grateful for the truth. But underneath all of that was something else, a growing sense of possibility that scared him more than the grief had. "Like I might actually be able to do this," he said. "Rebuild the church, rebuild my life. The church is just," Hank gestured, "at the ruins. Maybe the church is how I do that." Father Murphy smiled. "Your mother always said you'd make a fine leader when you finally stopped running from yourself. I don't know anything about leading. Leadership isn't about knowing everything, son. It's about caring enough to try and being humble enough to ask for help when you need it." That afternoon, Hank made his first call to Tom Bradley. The conversation was more encouraging than he'd expected. Tom could begin preliminary work in October if Hank could secure funding and permits. The foundation was indeed solid, built with limestone quarried from the hills outside town. With careful planning and community support, the project was feasible. But you'll need about 15 volunteers willing to commit to weekends for 6 months, Tom warned, and that's just for the unskilled labor. You'll still need licensed electricians, plumbers, roofers. "I'll find them," Hank said, surprising himself with his certainty. That evening he sat in his living room with a yellow legal pad making lists. Names of people who might help. Tasks that needed to be done, questions he needed to answer. The pad filled quickly with his careful handwriting, the first time he'd written anything more substantial than a grocery list in 3 years. Rose knocked on his door around 8 o'clock, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and a manila folder. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, settling into his mother's old chair at the kitchen table. "And I brought you something else." The folder contained membership records from St. Brigid's final year of operation. 12 regular parishioners, just as Father Murphy had said, but the list also included 26 families who'd attended irregularly, people like Rose, who drifted away after losing someone, or elderly folks who could no longer drive themselves to Sunday service. "Most of these people still live in town," Rose said, "and I think more of them would come back than you realize. Sometimes people just need someone to ask." "Rose, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why are you helping me with this?" "You could go to the Methodist church. They've got a full congregation, a proper building, regular services." Rose was quiet for a moment, looking out his kitchen window toward the ruins of St. Brigid's. "Because that's where I met God for the first time after David died. That's where your mother held my hand while I cried and told me I wasn't alone. That building represents something important, not just to the Catholics, but to anyone who's ever needed a place to fall apart and put themselves back together." She stood to leave, then turned back. "Besides, I think God has plans for you, Hank Weller, and I'd like to see what they are." After she left, Hank called the diocese office in Springfield. The conversation with Bishop Morrison lasted 20 minutes and ended with an appointment for the following Thursday. If Hank could present a viable restoration plan and demonstrate community support, the church could be his for $40,000, $20,000 less than the original asking price. That night, Hank slept without drinking for the first time in 6 months. He dreamed of hammers and saws, of white paint and gleaming windows, of his mother sitting in their old pew while sunlight streamed through glass that told stories of faith and redemption. When he woke, he knew exactly what he had to do. Hank's garage had been his father's workshop before it became a storage space for broken lawnmowers and empty beer bottles. Now, as he cleared away 3 years of neglect, he rediscovered tools he'd forgotten he owned. His father's hand-carved tool chest sat beneath a dust-covered top, filled with chisels and planes and measuring squares that Robert Weller had used to build half the cabinets in Millbrook Falls. The tools felt familiar in his hands, despite the bandages. His father had taught him to respect good craftsmanship, to take pride in work done right the first time. "A man's character shows in how he treats his tools," Robert used to say, watching 12-year-old Hank sand a piece of pine until it was smooth as silk. "Take care of them, and they'll take care of you." Hank spent the morning cleaning and organizing, rediscovering the rhythm of purposeful work. His burns protested every movement, but the pain felt cleaner somehow, earned rather than inflicted by his own choices. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the church project with growing clarity. The foundation was solid. The basic structure could be salvaged. With careful planning and community support, St. Brigid's could rise again. Around noon, he heard footsteps on his driveway. Rose McKenna appeared in the garage doorway, carrying a thermos and wearing work clothes, denim overalls and steel-toed boots that had seen better days. "Thought you might need some help," she said, surveying the half-organized workspace. "You don't have to." "Hank Weller, I've been organizing church basements and community centers for 20 years. I know how to clean a workshop." She poured coffee from her thermos into 2 cups. "Besides, if we're going to rebuild that church, we'll need a proper staging area for supplies and planning meetings." Rose smiled. "You think you're the only one who loved that place? I was married to David in that sanctuary. Your parents' wedding was there too, in 1965. Half this town has memories tied up in those walls." They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, sorting tools and making lists of what would be needed. Rose had a practical mind for organization, and her questions helped Hank think through details he'd overlooked. Where would they store materials during construction? How would they handle volunteers who wanted to help but lacked construction experience? What about insurance and liability? We'll need a proper committee, Rose said, wiping sawdust from her hands. 5 or 6 people who can commit to seeing this through. People with different skills. Someone who understands finance, someone with construction experience, someone who can handle publicity. Publicity? Hank, if we're going to raise $40,000 in a town this size, we'll need to tell our story, help people understand why this matters. The idea of publicity made his stomach clench. He'd spent 3 years trying to be invisible, avoiding conversations and eye contact, hoping people would forget about his guilt and shame. The thought of deliberately drawing attention felt like stepping naked into a spotlight. I don't know if I can do that part, he said. You ran into a burning building to save a statue, Rose replied. I think you can handle talking to a few reporters. That evening, they sat at Hank's kitchen table with the legal pad, making lists of potential committee members. Rose suggested Mrs. Chen for her organizational skills and historical knowledge, Pete McKinnon for construction expertise, Dr. Stevens because everyone in town respected her judgment. What about Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church? Rose asked. This doesn't have to be just a Catholic project. The whole community could benefit from having St. Brigid's restored. The idea had merit. Pastor Williams was a good man who'd tried to reach out to Hank after the accident, offering counseling and support that Hank had been too proud and too angry to accept. If they could frame the restoration as a community project rather than just rebuilding one denomination's church, they might find broader support. There's something else, Hank said, pulling out the architectural plans Mrs. Chen had copied for him. The original design included space for community meetings, social events, even a small food pantry. We could restore all of that. Rose studied the blueprints. Make it a real community center with regular worship services, but open to everyone for other things too. Wedding receptions, town meetings, grief counseling groups. The vision was becoming clearer in his mind. The way churches used to work, before everyone got so divided about denominations and politics. Your mother would love that idea. They worked until nearly 10 o'clock, filling pages with plans and possibilities. When Rose finally gathered her things to leave, Hank walked her to her car. Rose, he said as she unlocked her door, why are you really doing this? Helping me, I mean. She looked back toward the church ruins, barely visible in the darkness. Because I know what it feels like to lose your way, and I know what it feels like when someone reaches out a hand to help you. Find it again, she smiled. Your mother did that for me when David died. Now it's my turn to do it for someone else. After her taillights disappeared down Elm Street, Hank stood in his driveway looking up at the stars. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace and the earthy smell of early autumn. In 3 weeks, the county would tear down what remained of St. Brigid's unless he could present a viable alternative. 3 weeks to convince the diocese, the town council, and his own doubting heart that a broken-down mechanic could rebuild something sacred. He thought about his father's tools, cleaned and organized and ready for purposeful work. He thought about his mother's letter, promising that the person he used to be was still in there somewhere, waiting to come home. He thought about Rose's steady faith that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Tomorrow, he would start making phone calls. Tomorrow, he would begin asking for help. Tomorrow, he would take the first real step toward becoming the man his mother had always believed he could be. Tonight, he would simply stand under the stars and remember what hope felt like. The first committee meeting took place in Hank's garage on a Saturday morning in early October. 6 people sat in folding chairs around his father's workbench. Rose McKenna, Mrs. Chen, Pete McKinnon, Dr. Stevens, Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, and Father Murphy. On the workbench sat a simple mason jar with a handwritten label, St. Brigid's Restoration Fund. $18.47, Rose announced, shaking the jar so the coins rattled. That's what we've collected in 3 days from the coffee shop and the library. Pete McKinnon whistled low. Only $39,981.53 to go. Dr. Stevens laughed. The first time Hank had heard her laugh since her husband died 2 years ago. We've got to start somewhere. Pastor Williams leaned forward. I've been thinking about this all week. The Methodist congregation has been talking about community outreach, ways to serve the broader town. If St. Brigid's became a true community, a center open to all denominations, available for town events, I think we could make a case for broader support. What kind of support? Hank asked. Financial, certainly, but also volunteer labor. I've got 43 active members, and at least half of them have construction skills or professional expertise we could use. Mrs. Chen consulted her notes. I've researched grants for historic preservation. The state has a program for rural church restoration that could cover up to $15,000 if we meet certain criteria. What criteria? Hank asked. The building has to be at least 75 years old. St. Brigid's qualifies. It has to serve a demonstrated community need, and the restoration has to preserve the original architectural character. Father Murphy cleared his throat. I spoke with Bishop Morrison yesterday. If we can demonstrate genuine community support and a solid financial plan, the diocese will sell us the property for $35,000 instead of $40,000. The numbers were starting to add up. $15,000 from the state grant, $35,000 for the property, maybe $10,000 in donations if they worked hard at fundraising. That still left $20,000, plus the cost of materials and professional contractors for specialized work. There's something else, Doctor, Stevens said quietly. I've been thinking about what happened to Hank in that fire. The medical evidence doesn't make sense from a scientific standpoint. His injuries should have been much more severe. Hank shifted uncomfortably. Doc, I don't want people thinking I'm not saying it was a miracle. Dr. Stevens interrupted. I'm saying it was unusual enough to get people's attention, and sometimes attention can be converted into support. Rose nodded. People have been talking, Hank, not in a bad way. They're curious. They want to understand what happened, what it means. Some of them are calling it a sign, Pastor Williams added. A sign that St. Brigid's is supposed to be restored. The idea of being the center of that kind of attention made Hank's palms sweat, but he thought about his mother's letter, about her faith that he'd find his way back to church. Maybe this was how, not as someone seeking salvation, but as someone helping others find it. Okay, he said finally. What do we need to do? The next 2 weeks became a blur of activity. Hank took his accumulated vacation time and threw himself into the project with the focused intensity of someone who'd finally found something worth doing. He met with contractors, applied for permits, and slowly learned to navigate the bureaucracy of restoration projects. The mason jar appeared in businesses around town. Murphy's Diner, Chen's Used Books, McKinnon's Auto Shop, Stevens' Family Medicine. The donations came slowly at first. A $5 bill from Mrs. Patterson, who remembered Margaret helping her with groceries. $10 from the Thompson family, whose daughter, Margaret, had tutored in math. $25 from the volunteer. Fire department with a note that said, "For Hank's courage." By the end of the second week, the jar held $137.23. Not enough to change the world, but enough to prove that people cared. Hank found himself going to the church ruins every morning, coffee in, a hand, studying the damage and envisioning the restoration. The work would be enormous. New roof, new flooring, rewiring the entire electrical system, rebuilding the interior from the ground up. But the more he studied the problem, the more solutions he found. The original pews had been destroyed, but Tom Bradley knew where to find reclaimed church furniture. The stained glass windows were gone, but a craftsman in Springfield specialized in recreating period-appropriate designs. The bell tower could be rebuilt using the original plans Mrs. Chen had found. Most importantly, the foundation was solid. Everything else could be rebuilt on that foundation. On the third Friday morning, Hank was measuring the sanctuary space when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find a man he didn't recognize, maybe 40 years old, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, with calloused hands that marked him as someone who worked with his tools. "You Hank Weller?" the man asked. "Yes, sir. I'm Danny Rodriguez. I do electrical work in Springfield, but I grew up here. My grandmother was Esperanza Rodriguez. She cleaned this church for 30 years. Hank remembered her vaguely, a tiny woman who spoke broken English, but whose smile could light up a room. "I heard what you're trying to do," Danny continued. "I'd like to help. Pro bono, if you'll have me." "Why?" Danny looked around the ruined sanctuary. "My grandmother always said this was a holy place. Not because of the building, but because of the people who prayed here. She'd want it restored." He extended his hand. "Besides, I figure anyone brave enough to run into a fire for a statue is serious about his faith." As they shook hands, Hank felt something shift inside him, the first real stirring of confidence he'd experienced since the accident. Maybe he could do this. Maybe, with enough help and enough faith, they could build something beautiful from the ashes. That afternoon, the mason jar at Murphy's Diner was emptied and refilled twice. Word was spreading, and people were beginning to believe that St. Brigid's might rise again. Dr. Stevens called Hank on a Tuesday morning in late October, just as he was finishing his second cup of coffee and reviewing the latest construction estimates. Her voice sounded different, uncertain in a way that made his stomach tighten. "Hank, I need you to come to the office this morning. There's something we need to discuss about your test results." "What kind of test results?" "The blood work and tissue samples I took when you were in the hospital. The lab finally sent back the complete analysis." An hour later, Hank sat across from Dr. Stevens in her office, watching her flip through a manila folder thick with medical reports. She'd been his doctor since childhood, had given him stitches and antibiotics and lectures about wearing his seatbelt. He'd never seen her look this perplexed. "Hank, I'm going to share something with you, and I need you to understand that I've triple-checked these results with 2 different labs." She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "According to the blood gases we drew when you arrived at the hospital, you had carbon monoxide levels that should have killed you. Not injured you severely, killed you outright." "What does that mean?" "It means you were exposed to lethal concentrations of smoke and superheated air for an extended period. The tissue samples from your burns show cellular damage consistent, with temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Fahrenheit." Dr. Stevens spread the lab reports across her desk. "Hank, medically speaking, you should not have survived that fire. And the rate at which your burns are healing, it's not normal." Hank looked down at his hands. The bandages were smaller now, covering only the deepest burns on his palms. The blisters on his arms had healed without scarring, leaving skin that looked pink and new. Even the burns on his chest, the ones that had been 3rd degree, were closing faster than Dr. Stevens had predicted. "Are you saying something's wrong with me?" "I'm saying something's different about what happened to you in that church." Dr. Stevens leaned back in her chair. "I've been practicing medicine for 4 decades. I believe in science, in measurable causes and effects, but these results challenge everything I understand about human physiology." Through the office window, Hank could see the ongoing construction at St. Brigid's. Tom Bradley's crew had started work on the foundation repairs, and volunteers showed up every evening to help with cleanup and preparation. The project was moving forward faster than anyone had expected, fueled by donations that kept appearing from unexpected sources. "Doc, what are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to tell you that what happened in that fire wasn't just lucky. It was medically impossible." Dr. Stevens gathered the reports into a neat stack. "I don't know how to explain it, and I don't know what it means, but I think you should know. Hank drove home in a daze, his mind spinning with implications he didn't want to face. For 3 weeks, he'd been able to rationalize his survival as fortunate timing. Maybe he'd been in the coolest part of the building. Maybe the smoke hadn't been as thick as it seemed. Maybe adrenaline had protected him somehow. But Dr. Stevens didn't deal in maybes. She dealt in facts, measurements, data that could be verified and explained. If she said his survival was medically impossible, then it was. That evening, Father Murphy found him sitting on his front porch, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "Rose told me about your doctor's appointment," the priest said, settling into the other chair. "How are you feeling about it?" "Confused. Scared. Like maybe I'm losing my mind." "Why scared?" Hank was quiet for a long moment. "Because if it really was a miracle, then that means God has expectations for me. And I don't know if I can live up to them." Father Murphy chuckled. "Son, if God only worked through people who could live up to his expectations, he'd have a very small workforce indeed. But why me? I spent 3 years cursing his name, blaming him for everything that went wrong. I haven't been to confession in years. I've barely prayed, except to complain." "Maybe that's exactly why," Father Murphy said. "Maybe God prefers working with people who understand what it means to be broken. People who won't take credit for the miracles because they know they didn't earn them." The words settled over Hank like a blanket. For 3 years, he'd felt abandoned by God. Now he was being told that God had never left, that maybe God had been waiting for him to stop running long enough to be found. "What if I mess this up?" Hank asked. "Then you mess it up with good intentions and the support of people who care about you. That's not failure, that's just being human." The next morning brought unexpected news. Mrs. Chen called while Hank was having breakfast to tell him that the Springfield newspaper wanted to do a story about the restoration project. A reporter named Sarah Mitchell had heard about the fire rescue and was driving down that afternoon to interview him. "I told her you were a private person," Mrs. Chen said, "but she seemed very interested in the community aspect of the project." Hank's first instinct was to say no. He'd spent 3 years avoiding attention, and the thought of having his story printed in a newspaper felt like stepping off a cliff. But then he remembered Rose's words about helping people understand why the restoration mattered. "Okay," he said, "I'll talk to her." Sarah Mitchell turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a digital recorder that she placed carefully on Hank's kitchen table. She asked thoughtful questions about the church's history, the restoration plans, and the community support they'd received. "Can you tell me about the night of the fire?" she asked finally. Hank found himself describing that night in detail for the first time. The lightning strike, the overwhelming urge to save the statue, the strange experience of walking through flames that should have killed him. As he talked, Sarah's expression grew more interested. "Have you considered that people might see this as a religious experience, a sign of some kind?" "I don't know what it was," Hank said honestly, "but I know it changed me. And I know this church meant something to my mother and a lot of other people. If rebuilding it can help other folks find what they're looking for, then maybe that's enough." The story ran 3 days later under the headline, "Faith and Fire, Millbrook. False man seeks to rebuild church after miraculous rescue." Sarah Mitchell had written it carefully, focusing on the community aspect of the project and Hank's dedication to honoring his mother's memory. She mentioned the medical mystery of his survival, but didn't sensationalize it. The response was immediate. By noon, the Restoration Fund had received donations from Springfield, Carthage, and even some folks from St. Louis who'd read the story online. The mason jar at Murphy's Diner was replaced with a proper donation box that had to be emptied twice a day. More importantly, volunteers began appearing. A retired carpenter from Springfield offered to help with the sanctuary woodwork. A stained glass artist from Kansas City called to discuss window designs. A landscaping company in Carthage donated plants for the gardens they were planning around. The church, It's like watching something come alive, Rose said, as they counted donations one evening. The fund had grown to nearly $3,000. People want to be part of something meaningful. But with the attention came scrutiny. Not everyone in town supported the project. Some folks questioned whether Hank was the right person to lead a church restoration, given his history with alcohol and his years away from faith. Others worried about property taxes and zoning issues if the church became a community center. The criticism stung, but it also strengthened Hank's resolve. He'd spent 3 years caring too much about what people thought of him. Now he was learning to care more about what needed to be done than about whether everyone approved of him doing it. On Halloween night, Hank was working late in his garage when he heard car doors slamming in his driveway. Through the window, he saw 3 pickup trucks and at least a dozen people walking toward his garage. For a moment, his old paranoia kicked in. What if they were here to confront him about the church project? But as the group emerged into the light, he recognized friendly faces. Danny Rodriguez, the electrician from Springfield, the Morrison family from down the street, the Hendersons who ran the hardware store, even young Tommy Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandson, who was home from college for the weekend. "We came to help," Danny said simply. "Rose told us you were working on the construction plans tonight." For the next 3 hours, Hank's garage became a planning center. They spread blueprints across every available surface, discussed timeline and logistics, and divided up responsibilities based on everyone's skills and availability. Tommy Chen, who was studying business administration, offered to help with budget planning and grant applications. The Morrisons, who'd been married in St. Brigid's 25 years ago, volunteered to coordinate the fundraising campaign. Most surprising was Jack Henderson from the hardware store. He was known around town as a skeptic who rarely attended church and had little patience for what he called religious nonsense. But he'd brought detailed lists of materials and suppliers, along with an offer to provide lumber and hardware at cost. "Why?" Hank asked him directly. Jack looked uncomfortable for a moment. "Because this town needs something to believe in, and because you've given people hope that good things can still happen when somebody cares enough to try." As the volunteers finally headed home near midnight, Hank stood in his garage, surrounded by plans and lists and the tools his father had left him. The restoration fund now held over $4,000. They had commitments from a dozen skilled volunteers. The state grant application was nearly complete. For the first time since conceiving the project, Hank allowed himself to believe it might actually work. But more than that, he was beginning to understand what Dr. Stevens had been trying to tell him. His survival in the fire might not have been medically explainable, but it had given him something more valuable than his life. It had given him a purpose that connected him to his mother's faith, to his community, and to a future that looked nothing like the past 3 years of grief and guilt. Whether it was a miracle or just improbable luck didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what he chose to do with the gift of being alive. The town council meeting was scheduled for November 15th, and Hank had exactly 2 weeks to prepare the most important presentation of his life. The restoration project had gained momentum beyond anything he'd imagined. The fund now held $12,000. They had commitments from 37 volunteers, and the state grant application had been approved pending final approval from the town council. But not everyone was celebrating. The opposition had organized around County Commissioner Dale Brennan, a thin man with ambitious eyes who saw dollar signs where others saw sacred space. Brennan had convinced 3 local businessmen to propose an alternative use for the St. Brigid's property, a strip mall anchored by a chain pharmacy, with space for a coffee shop, a cell phone store, and a small medical clinic. More tax revenue, more jobs, more modern conveniences, Brennan argued in a letter to the editor published in the Millbrook Falls Gazette. Progress serves the living better than preserving monuments to the past. The letter stung, but it also clarified the stakes. This wasn't just about rebuilding a church anymore. It was about what kind of community Millbrook Falls wanted to be. A place that valued convenience over continuity, profit over purpose, or somewhere that still believed some things were worth preserving simply because they mattered to people's hearts. Hank spent his mornings working with Tom Bradley's crew, learning the physical reality of construction while his burns continued their improbable healing. His afternoons were consumed with phone calls, paperwork, and preparation for the council presentation. His evenings belonged to the growing circle of supporters who gathered in his garage to plan strategy and offer encouragement. Rose had taken charge of organizing community testimonials. She'd compiled a list of 43 people who wanted to speak at the town meeting about what St. Brigid's meant to them. Stories of weddings and baptisms, funerals that had brought comfort, quiet, moments of prayer that had changed lives. "We can't let everyone speak," she told the committee during their weekly meeting. "The council only allows 30 minutes for public comment. We need to choose the most compelling voices." Mrs. Chen suggested focusing on long-time residents whose families had deep connections to the church. Pastor Williams recommended including younger voices, parents who wanted their children to grow up in a community that valued its history. Dr. Stevens thought they should emphasize the practical benefits, a community center that could serve multiple functions, bringing people together across denominational lines. But Father Murphy had different advice. "Let Hank speak for everyone," he said. "This is his vision, his calling. If the council is going to approve this project, they need to hear from the man who ran into the fire." The suggestion terrified Hank more than anything he'd faced since the night of the accident. Speaking in public had never been easy for him, and the thought of standing before the town council to defend something so personal felt like volunteering for surgery without anesthesia. "I don't know if I can do that," he said. "Of course you can," Rose replied. "You've been talking to reporters, contractors, volunteers. You've been explaining this vision to everyone who'll listen. That's different. That's one-on-one conversation." "It's the same story," Father Murphy said gently, "just told to more people at once." They spent the next week helping Hank prepare. Rose coached him on organizing his thoughts and speaking clearly. Mrs. Chen provided historical documentation to support his arguments. Dr. Stevens helped him understand the medical aspects of his survival without making claims he couldn't prove. But the most helpful session came from an unexpected source. Danny Rodriguez, the electrician who'd volunteered. His services had experience speaking at city council meetings about building codes and safety regulations. "The trick," Danny said, "is to remember you're not trying to convince everyone. You just need to convince a majority of the council members. And you do that by making them feel something, not just think something." "How do I make them feel something?" "Tell them about your mother. Tell them about the night you almost died trying to save something sacred. Tell them what this project has done for you and what it could do for other people." Danny smiled. "Don't argue with Commissioner Brennan about economics. Let him make the case for money while you make the case for meaning." The architectural plans for the new church had evolved significantly since Tom Bradley first examined the ruins. Working with volunteers and the constraints of their budget, they designed something simpler than the original St. Brigid's, but more functional. The new sanctuary would seat 80 people comfortably, with removable chairs that could be stored. To create open space for community events, the basement would house a modern kitchen, meeting rooms, and a small food pantry. The bell tower would be rebuilt, but smaller and more affordable. Most importantly, the design preserved the spiritual elements that had made the original church special. The sanctuary still faced east. The windows were positioned to create that same cross of light on the altar at dawn. And there would be a special alcove for the Virgin Mary statue, scarred by fire but whole, a reminder that beautiful things could survive even the worst destruction. 3 days before the council meeting, Hank received an unexpected visitor. Bishop Morrison drove down from Springfield in a black sedan that looked official enough to make the neighbors peer through their curtains. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded respect without demanding it. "Mr. Weller," the bishop said as they shook hands on Hank's front porch, "I wanted to meet the man who's caused such a stir, Your Excellency." Hank wasn't sure of the proper protocol for greeting a bishop, but the older man waved away formality. "Please, call me Bishop Morrison. I understand you have ambitious plans for our old church." They sat on the porch while Hank explained the restoration project in detail. Bishop Morrison listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about funding, community support, and long-term sustainability. When Hank finished, the bishop was quiet for several minutes. "I've been a priest for 38 years, Morrison said finally. "I've seen many church restoration projects. Most of them are driven by nostalgia or institutional pride. This feels different." "How so?" "This feels like a calling." The bishop smiled. "I've read the medical reports Dr. Stevens shared with Father Murphy. I've seen the newspaper coverage and the community response. I don't pretend to understand what happened to you in that fire, but I recognize the fruits of it. The fruits. A broken man finding his way back to faith, a divided community, coming together around a common purpose, people discovering that they care more about their neighbors than they realized." Bishop Morrison stood to leave. "Those are the kinds of fruits that grow from holy ground, Mr. Weller." As the bishop's car disappeared down Elm Street, Hank felt a weight settle on his shoulders. Not the crushing burden of guilt he'd carried for 3 years, but the manageable weight of responsibility freely chosen. People were counting on him now. Not just the committee members and volunteers, but everyone who'd dropped coins in the mason jar, everyone who'd shared their memories of St. Brigid's, everyone who believed that sacred spaces were worth preserving. In a world increasingly focused on convenience and profit, the night before the council meeting, Hank couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with his presentation notes, reading them over and over until the words began to blur together. At 3 a.m, he gave up and walked to the church ruins. The construction site was quiet, tools and materials secured under tarps for the night. But in the moonlight, Hank could see the progress they'd made. The foundation was repaired, the walls were cleaned and reinforced. Stakes marked where the new roof supports would go. It no longer looked like the scene of a disaster. It looked like the beginning of something beautiful. He climbed carefully over the debris to the spot where the altar had stood. The Virgin Mary statue was back in Father Murphy's keeping, but Hank could visualize her future home, a simple alcove built into the east wall, where morning light would illuminate her smoke-darkened robes and serene face. "Help me find the right words tomorrow," he whispered to the darkness. "Help me explain why this matters." The wind picked up, rustling through the construction materials with a sound like distant applause. And for just a moment, standing in the ruins of something sacred that was slowly being reborn, Hank felt his mother's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "You already know the words, sweetheart," he could almost hear her saying. "Just tell them the truth." When he finally walked home, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. In 12 hours, he would stand before the town council and make the case for faith over profit, for community over convenience, for the belief that some things were worth rebuilding simply because they helped people remember who they were called to be. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he was sure he was willing to try. The Millbrook Falls Town Council met in the basement of the municipal building, a windowless room with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. By 6:30, every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls. Hank had never seen so many neighbors in one place, faces he recognized from the grocery store, the diner, the auto shop, all gathered to witness what might be the most important decision the town had made in years. Commissioner Dale Brennan sat at the head table with the 4 other council members, a stack of glossy brochures in front of him. His presentation materials looked professional and expensive, architectural renderings of the proposed strip mall, economic projections showing increased tax revenue, demographic studies proving the community's need for retail development. Hank's materials fit in a single manila folder. Mayor Patricia Thornton called the meeting to order and explained the evening's agenda. Two competing proposals for the St. Brigid's property: commercial development presented by Commissioner Brennan and community restoration presented by Hank Weller. Each side would have 20 minutes to present, followed by public comment and a council vote. Brennan went first. His presentation was polished and persuasive, full of charts and numbers that painted a picture of economic growth and modernization. The strip mall would create 47 jobs, generate substantial tax revenue, and provide convenient services that would keep local dollars from traveling to Springfield for shopping. "Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford," Brennan concluded, clicking through slides that showed declining population statistics and aging infrastructure. Millbrook Falls needs practical solutions for economic challenges, not expensive monuments to the past. Several council members nodded. The economics were compelling, especially for a town that had lost 3 businesses in the past 2 years. Then it was Hank's turn. He approached the microphone with hands that trembled despite his best efforts to stay calm. The room was so quiet. He could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. 40 years of living in this town, and he'd never spoken publicly about anything more controversial than a parking meter proposal. "Good evening," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. The microphone squeaked with feedback, and he stepped back instinctively. "Speak up, son," Mayor Thornton said kindly. "We're all here to listen." Hank took a deep breath and started again. "My name is Hank Weller. Most of you know me as Margaret Weller's son, or as the guy who works at Pete's garage. Some of you probably know me as the man who spent 3 years drinking too much and feeling sorry for himself after my mother died. A few people shifted in their chairs, but no one looked away. I'm here tonight to ask you to help me rebuild St. Brigid's Church. Not because I'm particularly religious. 3 months ago, I couldn't have told you the difference between a psalm and a hymn. I'm here because I believe our community needs places where people can remember who they're supposed to be." He looked out at the audience and saw faces he'd known his entire life. Mrs. Patterson, who taught him in Sunday school. The Rodriguez family, whose grandmother had cleaned the church for 30 years. Rose McKenna, sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and faith written across her face. St. Brigid's was built in 1892 as a sanctuary for the broken-hearted. Hank continued, his voice growing stronger. Not just Catholics, but anyone who needed a place to heal. For 50 years, it served that purpose. It was where people came to marry, to mourn, to celebrate, to find hope when life knocked them down. He told them about the original founders' vision, about the architectural plans designed to create holy space for ordinary people. He shared the financial projections Mrs. Chen had prepared, showing how a restored community center could be self-sustaining through event rentals and modest donations. But mostly, he told them about that night in the fire. "I don't know why I survived walking into those flames," he said. "The doctors can't explain it, and I can't either, but I know what it taught me. Sometimes we have to risk everything to save the things that matter most. And St. Brigid's matters, not as a building, but as a symbol of what this community can be when we decide to take care of each other." His voice caught slightly as he continued. "My mother believed this town was worth fighting for. She believed the people here were worth investing in, worth serving, worth loving, even when they made mistakes." He looked directly at Commissioner Brennan. "I think she was right. I think we're better than just another strip mall on another highway. I think we're the kind of community that builds beautiful things because beauty matters, that preserves sacred spaces because some things are more valuable than money." The room was absolutely silent. Hank could see people leaning forward in their chairs, hanging on every word. "The choice we're making tonight isn't really about a building," he said. It's about what kind of legacy we want to leave our children. Do we want them to remember us as the generation that turned everything sacred into something profitable? Or do we want them to remember us as the people who decided that hope was worth more than tax revenue? He stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Mayor Thornton opened the floor for public comment. Rose McKenna was the first to stand. She approached the microphone with the steady confidence of someone who'd buried a husband, raised 2 children alone, and learned that courage was just fear walking forward anyway. My name is Rose McKenna, and I've lived in this town for 42 years, she began. St. Brigid's Church is where I married my husband in 1981. It's where we baptized our children. And it's where I said goodbye to David when he came home from Afghanistan in a flag-draped coffin. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. After David died, I stopped believing in much of anything. I was angry at God, angry at the world, angry at everyone who still had their families intact. Margaret Weller found me in that dark place and helped me find my way back to the light. She did that not because she was paid to, not because it was her job, but because that's what people do in communities that still remember how to love each other. Rose looked directly at Commissioner Brennan. You want to talk about tax revenue and economic development? Fine, but what's the economic value of hope? What's the tax benefit of having a place where people can go when their marriages fall apart, when they lose their jobs, when they get diagnosed with cancer and need to remember that they're not facing it alone? One by one, others followed her to the microphone. Danny Rodriguez spoke about his grandmother's devotion to the church and her belief that sacred spaces deserved protection. Mrs. Chen shared statistics about rural church preservation and its positive impact on property values. And tourism. Tommy Chen, home from college, talked about young people needing connections to their community's history and values. Dr. Stevens approached the microphone last, her medical bag in hand as always. I want to address something that hasn't been discussed tonight, she said. The medical aspects of what happened to Hank Weller in that fire. Hank felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped to avoid making his survival a central issue in the debate. I've practiced medicine for 42 years, Dr. Stevens continued. I've treated every kind of injury you can imagine, and I'm here to tell you that Hank Weller should have died in that church. The carbon monoxide levels in his blood, the severity of his thermal exposure, the duration of his time in that building, every medical indicator says he should not have survived. The room was absolutely silent. I'm not here to tell you it was a miracle. I'm a scientist, not a theologian. But I am here to tell you that sometimes things happen that we can't explain. And when they do, maybe we should pay attention. Dr. Stevens looked around the room. This man survived something that should have killed him, and the first thing he did was dedicate his life to rebuilding something sacred. I think that says something about the kind of person he is and the kind of project this is. Commissioner Brennan's rebuttal was sharp and focused on practical concerns. Where would the ongoing funding come from? How would they handle insurance and liability issues? What happened if the restoration project failed halfway through completion? Dreams don't pay property taxes, Brennan said. Sentiment doesn't create jobs. We have an opportunity to bring real economic development to this community, and we're considering throwing it away for a building that couldn't sustain itself before it burned down. He made valid points, but his tone was dismissive in a way that seemed to rub people wrong. When he suggested that folks who want to worship can drive to Springfield like everyone else, several audience members shook their heads visibly. Mayor Thornton called for the council vote at 9:15, all in favor of approving the commercial development proposal. 2 hands went up. Commissioner Brennan and Councilman Richards, who owned rental properties and was always interested in anything that might increase property values. All in favor of approving the church restoration project? 3 hands rose. Mayor Thornton, Councilwoman Davis, and Councilman Morrison, Father Murphy's nephew, who'd grown up attending St. Brigid's. The vote was 3-2 in favor of the restoration. The room erupted in applause, but Hank barely heard it. He was thinking about the vote tally sheet Mayor Thornton had filled out in careful blue ink, the official record of a decision that would change everything. 3 people had chosen faith over profit, community over convenience, hope over fear. It was enough. As people filed out of the meeting room, many stopped to shake Hank's hand or offer congratulations. Commissioner Brennan left without speaking. To anyone, his face tight with disappointment. But most faces showed something Hank hadn't seen much of in recent years. Genuine happiness about a decision their community had made together. "How does it feel?" Rose asked as they walked to the parking lot. Hank looked back toward the municipal building, where light still shone in the basement windows. Inside, Mayor Thornton was probably filing the official paperwork that would transfer ownership of St. Brigid's property to the Restoration Committee. Tomorrow, they would own a pile of blackened timber and broken stone, along with the responsibility of turning it into something beautiful. Terrifying, he said honestly, and perfect. 6 months later, on a bright Sunday morning in May, the bell of St. Brigid's Church rang out across Millbrook Falls for the first time in 4 years. The sound was pure and clear, carrying across the downtown square and up into the hills where wildflowers were blooming in meadows that had been brown and lifeless when the restoration began. Hank stood at the front of the newly rebuilt sanctuary, watching people file into pews that smelled like fresh varnish and lemon oil. The sanctuary was smaller than the original, but somehow felt more intimate. Morning light streamed through new stained glass windows that told the story of redemption in blues and golds and deep reds that painted rainbow patterns on the whitewashed walls. The Virgin Mary statue stood in her alcove beside the altar. Her smoke-darkened robes, cleaned and polished, but deliberately left unrepainted. The fire damage was part of her story now, part of what made her beautiful. Like scars that proved someone had survived something terrible and chosen to keep living anyway. "Nervous?" Rose McKenna asked, adjusting the simple flowers she'd arranged on the altar. She wore a blue dress that reminded Hank of his mother, and her smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd helped build something meaningful with her own hands. "Terrified," Hank admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if people expect more than I can give them? Then you'll figure it out as you go, same as everyone else who's ever tried to serve something bigger than themselves." Rose squeezed his shoulder. "Your mother always said the best ministers were the ones who remembered what it felt like to need ministering to." The congregation was an interesting mix. Father Murphy sat in the front pew with 3 elderly women who'd been among St. Brigid's original parishioners. Behind them, the Rodriguez family filled an entire row, Danny and his wife and their 4 children, along with his mother and 2 uncles who'd driven down from Springfield for the reopening. Pastor Williams had brought a delegation from the Methodist Church, and Dr. Stevens was there with her adult daughter who'd flown in from Chicago just for the service. But what moved Hank most were the unexpected faces. Jack Henderson from the hardware store, who'd declared himself a skeptic but had donated more volunteer hours than anyone except Hank himself. Mrs. Patterson, now 86, helped to her seat by Tommy Chen, who'd driven home from college to be part of the reopening. Even Pete McKinnon was there, wearing a suit that looked like it hadn't seen daylight since his own wedding 30 years ago. At exactly 10 o'clock, Hank stepped to the simple wooden lectern that Tom Bradley had built from reclaimed timber. The church was full, 87 people by Rose's count, more than St. Brigid's had seen in its final year before the fire. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary's new sound system. "Welcome to all of you, no matter what brought you here this morning. Whether you're returning to a place you once loved, or visiting for the first time, or just curious about what we've been building here, welcome." He looked out at the faces turned toward him, seeing 3 generations of Millbrook Falls residents. united by something more powerful than denominational differences or theological disagreements. 6 months ago, this building was nothing but ash and broken stone. Most people looked at it and saw something that needed to be torn down and forgotten. But a few of us looked at it and saw possibility. We saw what it could become if people were willing to work together, to sacrifice a little, to believe that beautiful things could rise from the worst destruction. The congregation was absolutely quiet, listening. Today, St. Brigid's is reborn, not just as a Catholic church, though it will always honor that tradition, but as a community center, a place of healing, a sanctuary for anyone who needs to remember that they're not alone in this world. Hank's voice grew stronger as he continued. This building exists because 93 people decided to contribute something. Their money, their time, their skills, their faith, that good things can happen when ordinary folks choose to work together. He gestured toward the Virgin Mary statue standing serene in her place of honor. That statue was carved in Ireland in 1891 by a man whose name we don't even know. It survived the Atlantic crossing, 4 natural disasters, and a fire that should have destroyed it completely. It's scarred now, marked by the flames, but it's still here, still beautiful, still serving its purpose. Hank paused, thinking about his mother's letter, about Dr. Stevens's medical reports, about all the small miracles that had made this moment possible. Some of you might wonder if what happened the night of the fire was really a miracle. I can't answer that question, but I can tell you what I learned in those flames. Sometimes we have to risk everything to save the things that matter most. Sometimes we have to run toward the fire instead of away from it. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we discover that we're stronger than we believed, more loved than we knew, and more capable of building beautiful things than we ever imagined. He closed his folder and looked directly at the people who'd made this moment possible. This church is your church now. All of yours. Use it for weddings and funerals, for community meetings and children's programs, for quiet prayer and loud celebrations. Use it to remember that we belong to each other, that we are called to take care of each other, that love is always stronger than loss. The service continued with hymns and prayers, with communion offered to anyone who wanted it regardless of denomination, with testimonies from people whose lives had been touched by the restoration project. But what Hank remembered most was the moment when they rang the bell for the first time. The bronze bell had been salvaged from the fire, cleaned and restored by a craftsman in Kansas City who donated his services after reading about the project. When Tom Bradley pulled the rope and that clear, sweet note rang out across the town, people throughout Millbrook Falls stopped what they were doing and listened. After the service, Hank stood outside the church shaking hands and accepting congratulations. But his eyes kept returning to Rose McKenna, who was organizing the potluck lunch that would be served in the new fellowship hall. She caught him looking and smiled, the kind of smile that suggested this was just the beginning of something beautiful. As the afternoon sun slanted through the new windows, casting those same rainbow patterns his mother had loved, Hank felt a deep sense of completion. Not because the journey was over, but because he finally understood what the journey was for. He'd thought he was rebuilding a church. Instead, he'd rebuilt himself. And in the process, he'd helped rebuild a community's faith in what was possible when people decided to care more about each other than about their own comfort. The Virgin Mary statue watched over it all, scarred and beautiful, a reminder that the most sacred things are often those that have been broken and chosen to heal.